Hello everyone. Welcome back to another exciting session for Performance and Security Testing Academy. Today we are going to talk about HTTP HTTPS concept. So although this is a part 2 of the series, in part 1 we spoke about the HTTP request format, the HTTP response formats, the URL format also we spoke about in part 1. And today we will start with a quick introduction about myself. Then we are going to talk about the different request methods. And we are going to talk about get and post extensively because these are the two methods which are very widely used and are most important from a performance tester's perspective. Then we are going to talk about the response codes like 200, 500, 400, all these things. Before we move on to the topic, I would request you all to please subscribe to the channel and share this video if you feel there is anyone in your circle who would get benefit from this. A quick introduction. I am Jitin Chadha. I am founding director at Perfeasy Enterprises Private Limited. I have around 15 years of experience in performance and security testing. I have built and managed performance testing COEs. I have worked in all the roles, starting with test engineer to performance analyst, test lead, technical manager, etc. across different technologies and domains like e-commerce, m-commerce, content publishing, banking, investment, and some more. I have got a chance to execute around 150 plus projects in performance and security basically. I have worked with clients from across the globe like Adobe, BNP Paribas, Blue Yonder, Aon, Cemex, Scholastic, Max Life Insurance, and some more. A few certifications. I have HP LoadRunner AIS, IBM Certified Solution Designer for Rational Performance Tester, RPT, IBM Certified Specialist for Rational App Scan, and Rational Robo. Moving on. Before we talk about the request method or the response code, let me set the context like where these are being used. So when we say the request method, if you remember from the session one or the part one, in the HTTP request, the first thing that appears in case of a HTTP request is the method. So here we like spoke about two request methods. One was post and one was get. So this is what we are going to talk about the other methods as well as about this post as well as the get request methods we are going to talk about today. So here like we showed that there will be first line which would contain the request method, the URL and the version of HTTP. Then there will be some header fields, request header fields with corresponding values. If the request is post request, the body of the request would also contain some data. If it is a get request, we do not expect anything as part of the request, as part of the request body. Similarly, for the HTTP response, here we saw on the first line there was version, then status code. This is the response code or the status code that we are going to discuss. Here we took an example where the response code was 200, okay, but there are other response codes also 302, 304, 500, and a lot more. So that is why where we are going to talk about these today. Response headers are also there in a HTTP response. These are some example. Then we spoke about there will be some response body, but if we are sending a head type of request, the response would not contain any request body. Let us move on to the topic that we are going to talk about in details today. So today we are going to talk about the request method and corresponding description. The first one we are going to talk about is trace method. Trace method is used to trace the network path. When I say network path, in network there can be multiple nodes. Nodes can be a proxy, node can be a switch, node can be a router as well. So basically this method is used by networking people, people who are making sure that network is properly configured. So this trace method is used because when we send a request with a trace method, the response would give us the IP addresses of all the node it traversed before reaching the server. So it helps the networking team or the networking guys to identify the shortest path between the client and the server. Next is put. So put is the method. If we want to store some data or we want to upload some file or some data onto the server, we can use put method. Then third one is delete. Delete like is opposite of put. If we want to delete something, delete a file, delete a resource from the server, we need to send that request with method delete method. Then another method is head. So head, as in the previous slide also I spoke about, if a head request is sent, the response would not contain any response body. The response would only contain the header part of the response. Why it is required or who will be using? So when we are setting up a new server, so that time the configuration has to be set properly on the server side, and so that the server sends proper header. It is like from security perspective as well as the performance perspective as well as the functional perspective, the header fields are to be configured. So using the head request, the team who is configuring these fields or the server setup, who the people or the team that is doing the server setup can check if the expected headers are coming or something extra or something is missing, so that that can be tuned and configured properly. So here the header fields are to be checked. Next is options. Sorry. Options is used by the same team when we are setting up a server. So we have to make sure that from basically from a security perspective, we have to make sure that only relevant things are enabled and the extra things are disabled. So for example, this put and delete are very, I would say, risky methods. Why? Because using put, if put is enabled, I can upload a file can also be a virus. So to make sure that no one is able to upload some payload which is not required or some virus or some other thing, so put has to be disabled. Similarly, delete can like someone can delete a required resource or a file or a javascript or some style sheet. Even the configuration files they can delete if we have configured the delete also. So that is where the team who is setting up the server has to make sure that only the relevant or the required methods are enabled. So to confirm if the methods that they disabled are really disabled or they are still enabled, the options request is sent. So when we send a request of options, the response will give us the methods that are enabled on the server. For example, there is a like we have set up a server where only trace and options are enabled. So when I send an options request, the response would say trace, comma options. It will not list down any other request method. So it is going to help us in identifying the methods that are enabled on a particular server. Here I haven't mentioned about get or post because next we are going to talk about get or post in detail. So out of these, all these options and these things, in case of mobile apps, I have seen very lot of time options request is visible. Otherwise, these head, delete, put, trace are very rarely used, and like delete and put are mostly disabled itself. Let us move on to get and post. What is get and post? So first step is these both are request methods. So what is a request method? Request method is a type of request which is used to request for a resource from a server. I want something from the server, so I will send a HTTP request. It can be a get, it can be post, it can be head, it can be delete, it can be something. So something has to be I am requesting something from the server, so that is why I am going to send a HTTP request. And get and post are both of these method which can give me some results for my request. Now let us talk about some differences in the get and post. A GET request may or may not contain a parameter or a value it as part of the request. We can like just send a request to logo.jpg. It would not require any other data. I just need to give the server name. I have to give the path of the resource and proper name of the resource with some least use like uh, minimum number of header fields, and I may get that logo.jpg onto my server, onto my system or the client. But in case of post, we use post only when we have to send some value or a parameter onto the server. Where are these value going to be passed? In case of get, so get may or may not contain. But if we want to send some data for with a get request, the get request can also take values as part of the URL, and that part of the URL is called as query string. The right side of the query, like we spoke about in the part one, where we were talking about the URL structure. There, on the right side of question mark, everything that is present is a query string. So, values or parameters that are passed in case of get will go as part of the URL. A get may not have a value, but if there is a value, it will be part of URL itself. Now let's talk about the post. The values will definitely be passed as part of the request, but these values are going to be present inside the request body. Then only the post method is called. So next is, for get request, we should not be sending confidential data. Why? Because the URL is visible. So the data that will be, for example, let's say I am trying to log into my application. So user ID and password. If this user ID and password is passed as get request, so it will be visible as part of the URL. So someone sitting or standing behind me can read and will know my password as well. So this, though any confidential data should not be used in the get request. Post data or the post request or the post method is used to send confidential as well non-confidential data, because the body is hidden and it cannot be visible when we are working on a browser simply. Get request is mostly used to fetch static resources. Static resources can be HTML, simple HTML page, a JavaScript file, a PNG, a JPG. There we do not need much of our processing, or these things mostly do not need any input value to respond. The web server would not need any session ID or something to respond to a particular PNG or JPG. But in case we are using a dynamic page or a form or a page where input is required, so for that, post request will be used. For example, I am trying to search something. So the search term may go as part of the URL as well, get plus, but mostly if the some secure data is like we need to make sure that the data is traversed securely. So a post request will be sent, and the data or the value that I am trying to search will be passed as part of request body. Another classical example is registration. When we fill the registration form and click on submit, the data is passed as part of the post request body. The data will be present in the post request body. Similarly, login is also another example. One more thing or one more situation where we should not be using get request and we should be using post is the size of data. As the size of URL is limited, we should not be using URL to send a large amount of data. So similarly, just example that we earlier also discussed, in case of post, we will see a request body. In case of get, we will not see any request body. Let us move on. So request methods are done. What were the request method we spoke about? Put, delete, trace, options, head, get, and post. Then now we are going to talk about the response code or the status codes. there are five series of HTTP response codes. So this becomes very easy to remember because the total count of response codes is too many. So there will be like more than 100 response codes that are possible. So remembering everything becomes a little difficult. So it is easier to understand or remember the series wise. For example, if we see a 100 series status code, 100, 101, 102, anything, so this is informational response. If we see a 200 series, 201, 20, 200 itself, so that would be success or okay message. That means the request is successful. Redirect, if we see 300, 3xx is 300 series, that means the response is saying the requested resource is redirected. So we are getting a redirect kind of response. If we see a 400 series response code, that means there is some client error, and client is our browser or we are client. So that means there is a problem in the request that we have sent. So we need to make sure that the request that we are sending is correct. So 400 series is expected to come when there is a problem with my request. 500 series is server error. So 500 would come when there is a problem on the server side. Maybe server is down, or there is the server is getting timed out because of slowness, or it is maybe it is overloaded also can be one of the reason. So these are the reasons. So 100 is informational, 200 is okay success, everything is fine. 300 means no, this is the request that you are sending is present at some other place. 400 means you have to modify your request or you have to update your request and send a correct one. 500 means there is a problem on the server side. Let's talk about all these uh, series and we'll take also some examples. First is 100 series that I called informational. So one of the example is 100 continue is the status method. So this is status code and this is status method. So the response would come in 100 continue. If that kind of response code appears, that means the server has received the initial part of the request and it is okay, and the server will respond once it receives complete request. So it is like still receiving the request, initial part was okay, so that so here the server is communicating that the connection is ready, and the client and server are still communicating and expect the response once the request is complete. Next, we spoke about 200. This is most important. 200, 300 are two most important or mostly identified or mostly used status code that we see when we are doing the performance testing. So, for example, first one is 200 OK. If we are getting, and this is like if my request is correct, if my script is correct, so we expect a 200 response code. 200 okay, so that means the request that I sent was successful, it was correct, and the body of this response, so right now we are talking about response code, so this will be part of response. So the response body contains the relevant response. For example, if I have sent a request for an HTML file, the status code will be 200 OK, and the response body will contain complete HTML code. If I have requested for a JavaScript JS file, so the 200 OK would mean that the response body contains the JavaScript file. Let's talk about the second one. Second example is 201 created. This is also a success message, but this is used when we are trying to create a resource on the server side. For example, this is mostly used in case of microservices or API calls, where we are like creating a like we send a JSON request, and the it makes an entry into the database or NoSQL or wherever it is making. So in those situations we get 201 created. So we add a particular entry into the DB or particular NoSQL DB or wherever. So those kind of situations we will get 201 created. That means my request was successful and the resource that we tried to create or the JSON that I sent is successfully saved. Third one is 206 partial content. as that the name says partial content, that means the response, the complete response, let's say, is a quite big. For example, a video file. If we are like viewing a video, uh, downloading the complete video would take a lot of time. But what we'll do, we will send the response in chunks or small parts. So for a big responses, the complete response is broken down into multiple chunks. So this 206 response is saying that the response body contains a part of the request, sorry, part of the response, or it is a particular chunk is present, and and it is saying to the client that wait for the next chunks also. There will be multiple 206 response would come with particular chunks of the complete response. Once the complete chunks are all the chunks are available, then the complete thing can be displayed. Or video, in case of video, the player can start playing the video based on these chunks itself. Third type is 300 series, where this 300 redirect. So some of the example is 301, which is permanent redirect. So here 301 means that the request that I am sending, for example, I sent a request to abc.com slash images slash logo.jpg. But what happened is, from that particular location or that particular image is now moved to some other location. So I will get a 301 response code, and which means that we have to send a request to a new location, not this location. Similarly, in 302 is temporary redirect. So similarly, here also the resource has been moved, temporarily moved. In the 301, the resource is permanently moved. So going ahead, the request should be sent to the new address only. But in case of 302, that means temporarily it is moved. So every time, whenever we want to fetch the resource, we have to send this request only, and it will give 302, and we have to go to the new location of the resource. Third one is 304, which is not modified. So here there is a little context also. Uh, I believe you guys already know about the browser cache. So whenever we load a page, whenever we open any application and we browse particular pages, from that page the static content like JavaScript, images, style sheets, those things are expected to be very rarely changing. So the browser will save all the static content into its cache. How it helps? Now, whenever I open the same application next time, maybe 2 days, 5 days, 15 days ahead, then what would happen? It will check the cache first. Is that JavaScript, style sheet, image files already existing in my cache? So browser will load this from the cache, and the display would become faster. And it also reduces the number of requests that we need to send on the server side, plus the network consumption. If all the JavaScript style sheets are every time we keep loading multiple times, the network usage also increases. So to make it faster, browser has a cache feature. But here is a catch also. How the browser will know if this is the latest version, or maybe the image now has changed? So how will the browser know if this is a latest version or not? So for that, uh, the client will send the request to the server for that particular resource, but that request will contain the last modified date of that resource. Now the server is going to check if the last modified date of the resource present, or that image present in the client or the in my machine, is same as the modified date of the resource present on the server. If both are same, then the response from the server will be 304 not modified, that this resource is not modified, and browser can securely or successfully display or use this same image that is present in cache, and do not need to download it again. So 300 is redirect plus one not modified, so that it becomes the uh, the browser uses the cache to display the page faster. One question here. We were talking about redirect to a new location. Now, where I sent a request, the response is 301 or 302 that the resource is moved to a new location. But how will I know the new location? The same response would also contain one header field with the name location, and the value of this location will be the new path of that same resource. So make sure to check the location header field. In case you are getting a 301 or 302, it would contain the new location or the new path of the same resource. In case of JMeter, LoadRunner, NeoLoad, all these tools would automatically handle these redirects requests. So we may not need to do or worry about these things. Let's move on to the next set of response codes. 400 error, which is client, as I already said, that this is because there is some issue from the client side or there is some problem in the request itself. So first one is 400 400 bad request. 400 means that the request syntax is incorrect. So possibly the HTTP, in place of HTTP, I have typed like HTTP AP, or in the request header field I am sending something wrong, some invalid keyword I am sending, or those kind of requests. So the request syntax is not correct. Then we are going to get 400 error message. So 100, 200, 300 were okay, or a redirect kind of message. That means the request is correct. Now we are talking about the failure messages. One is 400. So why we need to understand these more? Because if we like by looking at the error, as a performance tester I'm talking. So as a performance tester, by looking at the error message, I should be able to identify the possible reason so that I can uh, improve or correct my script. Or I would definitely should get to know if the problem is because of my script or the problem is because of server side. So if 400 error is coming, 99% situations the problem is because of my script only. So I have to make some changes on the script. If this is 400, there must be something wrong in the header field, in the request body, request header, or the request URL. So just check the syntax, make sure you are sending the correct request. If you are getting 401 unauthorized, that means the server is expecting some authorization header, authentication header, some session ID, some authentication detail is required with the request, which our request is like not containing, and like which is missing from my request. So just check with the authentication what authentication value is to be passed, and make sure it is passed as part of the request. 403 forbidden. That means, so here 401 and 403 look similar. Here also authentication header or session ID is the problem. In case if you are getting 401, that means the authentication field is missing. So one example is the server was expecting a session ID or authentication header as part of the request, which we forgot to add that authentication header. But so that would give me 401. But in case I am getting 403, that means we are passing authentication header or the session ID, but the value that we are passing is not correct or is not valid. Maybe it has expired, that session ID or that authentication header is expired. So in those cases, we will get 403. But if we haven't passed any value, correct or incorrect, then we are going to get 401 unauthorized. Last one we are going to talk about in 400 series is 404, not found. This means the request or the resource we are requesting for is not present on the server side. I am looking for logo.jpg. Now that logo.jpg is not existing. So it will give me 404. I need to check if I am sending the request. So these things do happen when we get a new build or a new version given to us for testing. So there are a lot of resources which the development team or the DevOps or whoever is working on the backend side, they change the names or the locations of the server. So in those situations, we may start getting 404 not found. So we need to update our server calls based on that. Last series is 500 server error. So here, if we are getting a 500 kind of response when we are running our script, so that means there is some problem on the server side. It can also be because my network connection is disconnected. So just make sure it was definitely server error or it was because of network also. So I'm assuming our network was working fine. So there will be this is the issue with the server side. If I am getting 500 internal server error, that means the server is down and it cannot respond to my request because it is down. This is internal server error 500. Another message we can get is 502 bad gateway. That means, so here the request that I sent to the server received my request, but maybe the same server, some process is not running, or some middleware or some backend thing is not running, because of which it is not able to send the response. So then we are going to get bad gateway. Mostly this happens when there is some proxy or a gateway or a firewall or something already present before, in front of the app server or the web server or whatever server which is expected to respond. That server is down, but my proxy or the gateway is still working. So the 502 bad gateway will be returned by this proxy itself, and because it is not getting any response from the main server. Third one is 503 service unavailable. Here it means that server is currently unable to handle the request due to a temporary overload or scheduled maintenance. So this is like these things do happen when, like in case of flash sales or some deals come into e-commerce or those kind of application, and they have not scaled their environment up to that requirement. So we do see many times that 503 errors start appearing because the server is overloaded and is not able to respond. So here, this is a temporary error only. Once the load decreases, the people, like, because people will start getting this error and they will exit the application. So after some time, it is expected that the application would come back and it would still work. But during load conditions, the server started giving service unavailable error. So understand, 500 is server may have crashed, but 503 means it is down because of the load and it is expected to come back. 504 is the last one we are going to talk about in the 500 series. 504 gateway timeout. If we are getting this message, that means that let me set some context. So here, what I am doing is I submitted a request for registration. I filled my registration form. Click on submit to that registration. Now, what is this app server going? So this request reaches app server. Like first it reaches proxy, then it goes to the app server which accepted this request. Now this app server has to send this request to the database for insertion. What happened here is that database took a lot of time to execute or insert that query because of any reason. Maybe DB server was down or whatever. So app server has some timeout values. So it would wait for, let's say, 60-second or 300-second, whatever configuration we have done. So it will wait for that much time for the DB to respond with the confirmation that yes, this registration is successful. Then only it can respond. So it the app server waited for the DB or some middleware to complete that activity, but because of slowness on some secondary component, that server didn't get the response in timely manner. So the error will be gateway timeout, that I am getting a timeout error. My backend servers are not able to process the request and they are timing out. This is the meaning of gateway timeout. 504 error message. Thank you everyone for the time you gave to watch this video. I hope this helps you in getting better understanding about the HTTP concepts. I will try to create more uh, videos and more content so that it people who are trying to learn, the journey becomes easier. Thank you and happy learning. Bye bye.